Hello everyone, and welcome to Nimonik's EHS webinar series. Today's webinar will be on the link between risk management, critical controls, and auditing. I'll just give everyone a quick minute to settle in before we begin. Okay, so let's get started. Today's webinar will cover how leading companies utilize their risk management business processes to identify their biggest risks and associated critical controls, and then how they utilize various assurance processes such as audits and assessments to assure the efficacy of these controls. But before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce Nimonik as a company, my role here, and of course our presenter for today. So Nimonik is a software service that provides EHS managers with the tools necessary to ensure environmental, health, safety, and quality compliance in their operations. Nimonik is both a web service and an app that is designed to help auditors inspect their facilities for compliance issues, as well as stay on top of legal updates and maintain a legal register. My name is Kim Chanel, and I'm the Communications Manager here at Nimonik. I will be the one facilitating today's webinar, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation in the GoToWebinar question box, and we will gladly address them at the end of the presentation. So now to present this topic to us today, we have John Wolfe, a Nimonik partner and owner of Management Horizons. He has over 30 years of industry experience in the automotive, nuclear, power, oil and gas, and chemical manufacturing sectors. He managed the ISO committees that developed the ISO 9000 and ISO 14000 standards. But most recently, he was Senior Director of Operations Integrity Audit and Risk for Suncor Global Operations. And finally, he is the co-founder of Conforming, which was recently acquired by Nimonik. So I'm happy to say that we have attendees from all over the world joining us today. So thank you all for participating. And without further ado, here's John Wolfe on the link between risk management, critical controls, and auditing.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. As you heard from Kim's introduction, my particular expertise lies in the fields of health, safety, environment, and quality management systems, risk management, and audit. So today's webinar is focused on some of the learnings that I've discovered about what works well in terms of management system frameworks and the role that risk management and the identification and auditing of critical controls play in helping an organization become operationally excellent. Please note that some of the slides contain a lot of data that we won't have time to cover in this webinar, so they're really there for you for reference after the presentation if you want a copy. While all organizations should operate at a minimum in regulatory compliance, I hope that through this webinar and review of the Nimonik products, you will also get a good sense of the passion. You'll also get a good sense of the passion that Nimonik has to help organizations develop a compliance plus culture. But let's start with a safety moment. I've selected something a little different from the traditional safety moment, which might have addressed a teachable moment from one of your life-saving or golden rules around safety. Things like working with energy sources, slips, trips, falls, safe driving, or confined space entry. And instead, I've looked at some of the drivers for change in your business processes. It remains shocking to me that 60% of all operational losses result from preventable causes, and 80% of incidents are in fact repeat incidents, and that up to 30% of an organization's costs this year will be wasted fixing the same issues. Obviously, the companies that are operationally excellent have a significant advantage over those that are experiencing these types of issues. I don't know where your organization stands, but think how much more competitive you could be if you could apply those resources to things like new equipment, R&D, marketing. Two other quotes I've added in here that I thought were relevant to an operationally excellent company. The first one is, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. So great companies are learning organizations. They learn from their mistakes and the mistakes of their peers. They conduct quality audits and incident investigations and share their incident data to help prevent those repeat incidents. And the second quote is, you cannot find what you do not seek. Great companies also have robust risk management programs and data analytics. They seek to understand their business processes, risks, and controls. They don't hide bad news or risks from their management, shareholders, and the public, and they proactively look for risk and invest in the controls to manage those risks and maximize their opportunities. So in my experience, the organizations with robust ISO 9001, ISO 14001, OSHAS 18001 health safety systems, and kind of lean manufacturing processes are the most successful. And why is that? In my experience, the ones that are most successful go beyond simple regulatory compliance where it adds value. They empower their people and recognize the importance of safety in a customer-first culture. They understand their risks and opportunities. They understand their business and operations processes and have the right metrics to drive and reward the right behaviors. And they have simple, up-to-date procedures that they actually follow. They have competent staff, contractors, and suppliers. And they have a good management system framework to drive all that. And they audit a lot. So let's take a look at what constitutes a good management system framework. Most organizations today are moving towards an integrated management system rather than a separate ISO 14000 or 9000, 18001 system. Most companies, I think, in the future will in fact have an integrated system. All of them are pretty much built on the plan, do, check, act, improve model that was developed back by Deming back in the early 1980s and is now used by millions of companies around the world. And the slide that I'm illustrating here is actually from Suncor, and it has about 18 elements and about 67 requirements supporting these 18 elements. Other companies have organized these elements into as few as 10, but the number of requirements pretty much remains the same across most of the companies that I've looked at, and I've probably looked at about 100 around the world. Now, if you have hazardous operations and you have to layer in process safety requirements, then you can add another couple of hundred more requirements. But the elements that we're going to look at today, another couple hundred requirements. The elements that we look at today, though, are going to be focusing in on regulatory compliance, risk identification and assessment and management, and audit. And I'll start with regulatory requirements. So the element dealing with legal and other requirements usually outlines requirements to establish a business process, to identify legal and other commitments, and those other commitments are things made, things like promises that you make in your permit and license applications and agreements. Could be to a regulator, could be to a First Nations group, it could be to a host of other third parties, but it's something that you've promised and you're going to be held to it. And it also includes requirements to ensure that the organization has evidence that it keeps this information up to date and that it is operating in compliance. These commitments are usually captured in some form of legal registry. So there are lots of good examples of effectively designed legal registries, but at a minimum, they should document what is the requirement that we're looking at, how, why, and where is it applicable in your operations, who is responsible for demonstrating compliance, and what evidence do you have that you are in fact operating in compliance. This usually involves generating evidence in the form of records or reporting of performance. For example, it might be waste management generation or shipment records, air or water monitoring records. It might be training records, it could be an inspection or a maintenance record, or in fact it might be an audit. And again, Nimonik can show you lots of good examples and help you develop a good legal registry, and in fact provide audit protocols for those situations where you do not have good existing evidence of compliance, and or you want the added level of assurance that an audit provides. And in fact, our next webinar is focused on the attributes of what a good legal registry looks like. The one that I've shown you here actually was a short form of one that was listed for Suncor, and you might You might kind of wonder why most companies don't have this, and it always surprises me. A lot of companies that I talk to, they say, well, I've never been charged, so I must be in compliance. Well, that's not the way it works if you have to go to court. To protect your company, you'll need evidence showing proof of controls, such as informing workers about hazards, or evidence of training and competence, or inspection and maintenance records. And a good legal registry will provide a framework to capture that important data, because you'll know exactly what you had to be in conformance with or compliance to. You'll know who was responsible for doing that. You'll know what controls you had in place, and you'll know what evidence that you've got to support those claims. It can be pretty costly if you're not. Just think about BP and the billions of dollars it's paying right now for non-compliance when it spilled millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Or the organization that I work for, Suncor, that lost hundreds of millions of dollars a few years ago in shut-in production because it actually failed to install a piece of pollution prevention equipment that it said it would in its permit application. So there it was not even actually being in compliance, it was a promise in a permit and license application. So I would also suggest that you consider the potential consequences of non-compliance as an input to your legal registry as well, and therefore into the audit planning process, because again, not all regulations are created equal, and you want to audit those with the highest potential consequences to your company if you're deemed to be out of compliance. Perhaps the most critical and foundational element in the management system framework addresses the business process for risk identification and management. The slide that I've used in this webinar illustrates the framework developed by the ISO to establish a risk policy, a risk standard, and supporting procedures, appropriate roles and responsibilities, training, and monitoring program to support that business process. It also outlines the methodologies to analyze and assess the risks and then treat them, usually by putting controls in place to a nature and depth suitable to mitigate them to a level where the company can live with the risk. Having worked with the ISO for many years, I highly recommend that you use ISO standards whenever possible. It really contains the best thinking from around the world, and you can always go beyond the requirements where it makes business sense. In any case, this element is one of the foundations of an operationally excellent management system. If you have good risk and control data, you will have better information to help you allocate your scarce resources against the right opportunities and your highest risks. The concept of risk includes 5 components. The first is the risk, or the hazard inherent in any activity otherwise deemed beneficial, an undesirable event which brings out the hazard, the adverse consequence of that undesirable event, and uncertainty whether the undesirable event will happen or not, the likelihood, probability, and frequency. For example, a hazard is present when the ground is covered with ice. There is no risk if no one has to walk or drive over it. There's some risk if one person has to walk over it. The consequence might be a fall with no injury all the way to a fracture. There's an unacceptable risk if the ice is at the entrance to a busy office with multiple steps and lots of people coming and going. In this case, the likelihood of a worst case increases. In addition, the hazard may not pose a risk at all if it's not encountered, or it may be reduced in severity and likelihood through control treatment, i.e. we remove the ice through heated steps, a covered walkway, or we add some salt and hand railings and a proper footwear policy and provide safety training on slip, trips, and falls. In that case, we've actually mitigated the risk. So one of the important concepts here is the consideration of inherent risks, the risk with no controls present. After we apply control treatments, we are left with residual risk. A more visual way to look at risk is to consider these controls or risk treatment measures as layers of protection. Let's look at this slide using the example of driving a car. What is the risk inherent in driving? And the answer is momentum, because we're moving. What is the potential undesirable event? A collision of varying severity. So what are our protective layers? Well, they could be driver training and habits, obeying the speed limit, rules around distracted driving, drug and alcohol policy, graduated license, a whole series of preventive layers. What is a mitigating control? Could be seat belts, could be inherently safer design for the vehicle, airbags, safety framing. What's a recovery control? Insurance policies. So the consequences, of course, vary based on speed, number of persons, property impacted, and the likelihood varies on the number of people that are actually driving, and a whole series of other things. To help you determine those inherent and residual risks after control treatments, most organizations deploy a risk matrix. This particular slide shows one that Suncor used a number of years ago. They've updated it since, but it's still quite valid. In this particular risk matrix, the risk receptors are considered in 4 groups: safety, environmental, economic, and reputation. And in all cases, you pick the receptor that's going to have the highest risk rating. Suncor utilized a 6x6 matrix with consequence ratings ranging from 1 to 6 for ranging from minimal impacts to catastrophic impacts running horizontally, and likelihood ratings 1 to 6 ranging from very likely to extremely rare running vertically. So for illustrative purposes, let's pick a rare event with some nasty consequences. If you operate a pipeline, one of the worst potential risks is a large spill to a sensitive ecosystem, such as a lake or river or ocean, or perhaps an estuary of some kind. The main receptors in this case would be environmental, economic, and reputation, and the inherent risk without controls is high, both in terms of likelihood and consequence, potentially billions of dollars in cleanup costs, fines, lost share value, and of course reputation. These scenarios place the risk somewhere in the upper right quadrant as an unacceptable level 1 risk. The intent then is to look at controls that we have in place and see if they are in nature and depth sufficient to lower the likelihood and the potential severity to an extent that we can remove that risk from the upper right unacceptable level 1 portion of the matrix down to become a more acceptable level 1 or 2 or 3 ranked risk. For example, we might start with the design of the pipeline, the route selected, the quality and thickness of the steel used, the quality of the welds, the type of pipeline coating, the implementation of a pipeline integrity program, smart pigging, regular inspections, leak detection programs, emergency response programs in place. With such controls in place, the residual risk may be deemed acceptable. You should score all 4 receptors in most cases and select the one with the highest rating. For presentation to management, many companies use this risk ranking to create heat maps, which are color-coded red, orange, yellow, green, level 1, 2, 3, etc. This provides an easy way to prioritize and justify the actions needed to invest in additional controls. It is important to show both inherent risk and residual risk, especially for your level 1 risks, because if all you ever do is present to management your remediated level 2 or 3 risks, you've in fact masked what the biggest company risks are, and you may not focus on the efficacy of those more critical controls. There are lots of methods available to us to help identify hazards and undesirable events. Those can include simple things like brainstorming, field-level risk assessments, job safety analysis, what-ifs, HAZOPs, failure mode effect analysis, PHAs, process hazard analysis, layers of protection analysis. There are lots and lots of very sophisticated tools that can be applied, and very, very simple tools that can be applied based on the nature of the risk. The methodology that I preferred to use during my time at Suncor as a key piece of the audit planning process was something called a bow tie analysis. On the left-hand side of the page, you have the threat causes and preventative controls. In the middle, you have the business activity and risk event being considered. And on the right-hand side of the page, the recovery preparedness controls and potential consequences. This methodology helps you visualize what controls are critical to either prevent the event, reduce its impact, or recover quickly from it. And it's a great way for risk and control owners to communicate that information as training or to communicate it to their management teams if they're looking for additional resources. Let's look at an example of a completed bow tie for a fictitious East Coast marine operator, looking at the potential release of a product to a waterway. You can see the listing of threats and the current state preventative and recovery controls. You can also see the consequence ratings for multiple receptors on the far right. And this was actually an example of a bow tie that my group prepared when we were looking to audit unsafe release of petroleum product or non-compliant transportation activity. We sat down with our clients to review what the regulator was auditing, what the business was auditing themselves, what performance monitoring data they had, what incidents they'd had, to try and select the controls, the critical controls that would add value for us to audit independently to validate the information that they already had to support control of their level 1 risk. Of interest, the elements of a management system can also be looked at through the same lens of preventative and recovery controls and also aid in audit planning. So this is a look at the 18 elements in the Suncor management system, essentially using a bow tie. And often when we look at at the efficacy of a particular risk and control, we also do, as we're doing an audit of their management system, we apply this particular lens. At the end of any risk assessment, we often end up with a list of risks, that is undesirable events with their consequence and likelihood delineated either using team judgment, expert opinion, or detailed quantitative analysis. We call this list a risk inventory or a risk registry. And there are, again, many templates available to capture data, but at a minimum, you should be capturing, what is the risk being addressed, where is it located, who owns it, what is the inherent risk rating, what are the existing control treatments, a description of the control type, what is the residual risk rating, and then a determination of acceptance or plan of action to add more controls. At Suncor, we had one, I think it had about 60 data fields that you could turn off and hide and come down to about 10 or expand depending on the level of sophistication that you wanted. And it went right down to individual asset tags. It went right down to individual controls based on a hierarchy of controls from engineering down to PPE. And it also went all the way out to future residual risks. So if you went through this process the first time, you discovered that you did not get, with the planned actions you're going to take, an adequate risk ranking, it would take you out one more level as well. So loss of sophistication or something very simple. The secret here is to have clean data and start to consolidate it down to information that management can use. So at Suncor, we tried to build an enterprise risk management program, starting at the bottom with individual risk and control owners, doing what-ifs and PHAs and LOPAs and HAZOPs, FMEAs, and you would sometimes have hundreds, if not thousands, of data entries for complex operations outlining your level 1, 2, and 3 risks. This information was then consolidated into business area risk registries at the VP level, which might contain a couple of hundred of the highest, certainly all the level 1s and the higher level 2s. That information would then be presented quarterly to the executive and the board as further consolidated down into what we call principal risks. And there might only be 12 of those. But we were looking for a direct line of sight between those level 1 risks at the principal, at the executive level, to all the level 1s and high level 2s that generated it across the business. The executive was always interested in the adequacy and efficacy of those control treatments, especially for the level 1 and 2 risks. And the most effective controls, of course, are those that eliminate the risk. The next most effective controls are the engineering controls. So, for instance, you might add machine guards, interlocks, or barriers, safety instrumented systems, or you might change a process. For example, the electronic industry moving from using hazardous solvents to clear circuit boards to a water-based cleaning system, or you could choose to move to just-in-time inventory and cut back on the storage of hazardous, toxic, or explosive materials. The next in the hierarchy are administrative controls, such as operating procedures and training. And of course, the last resort and least effective is personal protective equipment. So when you look at your risk registry and you've got a level 1 risk, what should you be looking for in terms of control adequacy? Well, the nature and depth of the control should be commensurate with the potential consequences. So you should be looking for a lot of engineering controls and a lot of really tight administrative controls. If all you see is administrative controls and PPE, you're probably already in trouble. So more mature companies assign a numerical value to the different categories of controls to ensure that the risk owners can't improperly downgrade a level 1 risk to a level 2 risk using least controls that are lower in the hierarchy. And it's very interesting when you start using methodologies such as HAZOPs and PHAs and LOPAs, you get immediate value and risk reduction through the identification of gaps in this control adequacy. I also find that you find a lot of orphan children where people there's nobody who's been assigned to manage a particular risk or a particular control. So the risk registries are really great in capturing that data as well. Now, if you operate a business, there will always be risk, and this simple slide makes the point that there are trade-offs, and management gets paid to determine the company's risk tolerance. To engineer out a risk totally can be quite cost prohibitive. So, again, in a due diligence world, what they're looking for is to make sure that you've identified that risk, and then you applied reasonable controls to manage it on an ongoing basis, and that you know those controls are working. The International Council on Mining and Minerals has a really good booklet that you should get that talks about critical controls, and they have a great slide in their guide which talks about kind of the definition of what a critical control is. And it's basically, is the control performance specified, observable, manageable, and auditable? Is the control crucial to prevent? Is the control crucial to preventing the event or minimizing the consequences of the event? Is it the only control, or is it backed up by another control in the event that the first fails? Would its absence or failure significantly increase the risk despite the existence of other controls? Does it address multiple cases or mitigate multiple consequences of the hazard? In other words, if it appeared in multiple places on the bow tie or a number of bow ties, this may indicate it's a critical control. So if you answered yes to most of those questions, then that helps determine whether the control is critical. But in many ways, it's common sense. In discussion with the risk and control owner, they pretty much should know what are the critical controls. They should have a good idea, and it's their responsibility to have data to show that those controls are working with efficacy. And it's your job as the auditor really to help them through that process and to audit those most critical controls and make sure, in fact, that that auditee has processes in place to ensure their efficacy on an ongoing basis. In almost all serious incidents, you have multiple causes with multiple layers of protection having failures, all lining up under some unusual circumstances or operating condition. And that usually involves some sort of failure of the process design or a protection system, an alarm system operating within a safe limit that failed, your safety instrument systems failed, something in your procedures failed, or perhaps the procedure was adequate, the staff didn't follow it, or perhaps the procedure was wrong. You had a failure in your management system, your safety culture failed, alertness. All these things have to line up in something. This is basically called a Swiss cheese model. So multiple things have to fail in order for usually for really bad incidents to happen. The BP spill provides a great example of the Swiss cheese model of critical control failures. And in fact, in this case, 8 different critical control areas had failures that all had to line up for the incident to occur. So I hope there's no one from BP on the line, but there was an excellent book out there called Failure to Learn, and BP actually had VPs on board the rig that day celebrating personal safety performance. Those VPs, I don't think, had a risk registry of process safety risks and controls in each of these different categories that might have driven them to ask the right questions. And if they had, perhaps those controls might have been audited and disaster averted. By taking these lessons learned from BP's unfortunate incident to our own offshore operations at Suncor, we drove audits looking at the efficacy of the controls in all our areas, and I'm sure every other offshore operator did. The other thing that incident did was it drove us to look at our joint venture operations where we were not the operating partner. Anadarko, I think, got handed about a $5 billion bill as the non-operating partner. So it's interesting as you look at some of these incidents and the critical control failures, it often drives you in other directions to look at risk and governance activity. So as I designed our particular audit program each year, there were a number of inputs that went into it. So one of the inputs was incident investigations and key performance indicator analysis, following up on specific incidents and trends both within our company and the industry. Looking at causal analysis and determining, what critical controls had failed and where were those companies in use across the operation in the company. Looking at major operational risks and control review. So as you saw in that hierarchy, we tried to develop an enterprise risk management program where we had risk inventories at the front line, driving through to risk registries at the VP level, driving through to a list of principal risks at the executive and board level, and looking at what those level 1 risks were that in aggregate came together to be a principal risk, and then even within those, which were the highest level 1 risks as we designed our audit program. We also looked at OEMS, operations integrity, operations excellence management system self-assessments and audits. So in our company, every auditable unit had to do an annual self-assessment of all 18 elements, and that data was available to us to see where we had systemic weakness in the management system implementation across the company. And then we would look at our strategy and values to see where the company was driving itself, and then of course prior audits and assessments so that we didn't duplicate effort. Those things fed into our hopper of things that we would propose to look at. So we developed a rolling 5 to 7 year audit plan, which ensured coverage of the company's 51 auditable units around the world, with higher risk operations, those with hazardous processes audited on a 3-year frequency, and lower risk operations audited on a 5-year frequency, retaining the right, of course, to audit at a higher frequency based on their performance. So there were facilities that we visited every year. Within that timeline, we also took into account basically all the things that I just mentioned. So the principal risks, consultation with business units, the strategy, value drivers, prior audit insights, external risks, the risk registries that contained all the level 1 risks and the associated controls, legal registries, and came up with 3 categories of audits that we did annually. So one set of audits was an OEMS audit, where we would do deep dives on the weaknesses that we saw within the self-assessments for the operations excellence management system. for non-hazardous operations where process safety didn't apply, and then for those that actually had process safety requirements they had to meet, and we would do deeper dives on their process hazard analysis, their mechanical integrity, their quality insurance, inspections, reportings, all the extra requirements that fall under process safety. And then a series of annual risk-based audits, which were environmental, safety, emerging risks, compliance, depending on what was the need of the individual business unit. This slide lists some of the audits that were considered as inputs into that funnel of inputs. One dealt with, for a given year, one dealt with facility siting. So this is basically Texas City blast and toxics, looking at API standard compliance and Suncor's own standard on facility siting. Another one looked at risk transparency and the effectiveness of the risk identification and management programs in individual units. Another looked at pipeline integrity of non-regulated lines. Again, this is just a sample of some of the audits that would be considered in a given year. So in summary, all audit programs have limited resources and need to minimize their impact on operations. It's therefore important to focus efforts on providing assurance that the controls used to prevent incidents with the highest consequence or frequency are operating with efficacy. You need to ensure that your front line's operation leadership clearly identifies their hazards, their risks, and associated controls and who owns them. They are the first line of defense, and they need evidence that the controls are adequate in terms of the nature and depth and that they're working properly. The second line of defense is the management level above that risk and control owner, who need to validate that those frontline leaders have accepted their responsibility and that they, as leaders, have provided them the resources needed to close out any incidents, audit findings, or fund additional controls that are needed. And then the third line of defense is the corporate audit team, which I suspect most of the people on the line are. Internal audit, health, safety, environment, quality corporate teams. I suggest that you start with your own level 1 inherent risk controls and work your way down the food chain, recognizing again that the frontline and risk control owners have that ultimate responsibility. And in an ideal world, they will already assess the efficacy of the risks and controls under their purview, and you're simply confirming that they got it right. That's a multi-year journey to get to that point, but that's really where you want to be over about a 5-year period. That covers off what I wanted to cover in this webinar, and I think we've got about 20 minutes left for questions.
Yes, so thank you, John, for that incredibly informative session on risk management. So attendees, please drop down any last-minute questions you may have, and then I'll proceed to share these with John. But before I do, I just wanted to quickly point out that Nimonik would love to be part of your efforts to improve your regulatory compliance, so please feel free to give us a call or send us an email for more info. And with that in mind, we'll tackle a few questions. So the first question here for you, John, is who gets to decide on what is audited, the corporate audit group or the business leadership team?
It's usually a collaborative process depending on the nature or degree of independence that you've been granted. I was very lucky. I've actually reported straight to the Suncor board, but most people report through to an EHS vice president, who often reports through either to health and operations VP or perhaps an HR VP. So usually it's a collaborative process based on discussion about kind of what keeps them awake at night, and you know, are they happy with the controls that they've got in place to manage their most significant risks, and then it's an analysis sitting down with them depending on the quality of the risk registries that they've got, and the incidents that they've had, or the incidents that have happened in industry, to figure out where the team can add the most value. So it's, I would say, in the best companies, it is very much a collaborative process. In the really really high-performing companies, it's a collaborative process, but the corporate audit group should have the ultimate say.
Great. I have a second question for you here. Some of the risk and critical control audits you mentioned don't appear to have clear audit criteria and or audit protocols. How do you audit them?
Right. So in some cases, you'll run into a situation where there's a risk, and there isn't necessarily a correspondingly clear regulatory requirement, or indeed an internal corporate standard. So in those cases, usually what we did, we used the 18 elements of our operations excellence management system as the lens to look at that particular risk and the efficacy of the controls, or basically how they were managing that risk. Again, because there were usually controls there, they just didn't have often operating procedures or good training programs, et cetera, associated with them. So we would use the lens of the OEMS.
Perfect. Third question here. Building the risk inventories and registries look like a lot of work. How do you get in? How do you get buy-in and data quality?
Right. So the old adage of garbage in, garbage out really does apply here. And too much data, too many controls to consider takes away the focus of management on oversight activities and resourcing activities. So if you go down this path, you really need to think it out, and you really need to have good training and good facilitators to help you, so that you start to collect quality data right from the get-go. And that usually means sending kind of a SWAT team around your business, so that you normalize the data, that you get consistent information and consistent interpretation, rather than just capturing issues. Now the challenge in that is you don't always get the buy-in from the risk and control owners at the beginning, but you get much better quality data, and that's really the secret to this process, is to have a limited data, but good data in your risk registries, because you'll have tons of stuff flowing out of HAZOPs and PHAs, and all that stuff can be managed by the individual risk and control owners, the recommendations that are contained in those. By the time something gets into a VP level risk registry, you want it to be pretty good focused level 1 and 2 risk and control data. Often, certainly the level 1s with bow ties, so that they can get a good, clear grasp of what their priorities, what they should be focusing their efforts on, what they should be resourcing, and where they should be spending their money.
Great. We have another question here for you, John. Is the selection of a 6x6 or even a 3x3 risk matrix established on the basis of probabilistics, or simply more a matter of user preference?
A 3x3, I think, is perhaps kind of that's probably suitable for a very simple, not complex organization. You pretty much do need a 5x5 or 6x6 for more complex operations with a lot of hazards and risks and controls and consequences. But again, whether it's 5x5 or 6x6 is really user preference.
Great. Another question here from James. Would you consider the lack of leadership risk knowledge as a real barrier when setting up CapEx and OpEx budget? Most organizations do not set up their budget to risk mitigation objectives. Thoughts?
Yeah, in fact, I actually did a whole audit on the capital allocation process because it was not consistent across the company. And what I was seeing in audits was year after year deferral of resource allocations associated with level 1 risks, which of course put the company into a deeper and deeper and deeper liability hole. So yes, you need a good business process for capital allocation that takes the incident data and the data from your risk registries and controls and makes it transparent so that you get a better outcome and the squeaky wheel isn't getting the grease, or the flavor of the moment isn't getting the resource. It's a common problem across most organizations and is definitely an auditable business process.
Great. So we have another question here for you. How often do you update your risk registry?
Annually at a minimum. But again, you should have a management of change process in place so that the registries, like there should be an electronic format if you can, and a database, so that you've got, as incidents happen, as through your management of change process, you are updating that. But in terms of presentation to senior leaders, the executive, and the board, that happened quarterly.
Perfect. Another question here. Hard choices must be made when industries are facing downturns. As a risk manager, do you change your risk appetite after a downturn when your audit program was significantly reduced?
Yes. Now, having said that, those risks don't go away, and what you have to do is put in place interim control measures. So if you were planning on spending capital to engineer out a risk or to downgrade that risk, and now you can't because of the downturn, then what you're expected to do is put in place additional mitigating controls, which might be an increased frequency of monitoring or measuring or inspection, as again due diligence to say, we couldn't do what we wanted to do because we've been downsized and the resources aren't there. But here's still the way that we're managing that risk that we recognized.
Perfect. Thank you. So attendees, please drop down any last questions that you have. I think you touched upon it earlier a bit, but we have another question about capital allocation. So the question goes, capital allocation and operating cash allocation, is risk management conducted on a kind of sliding scale based upon affordability?
No. Maybe just repeat the question, sorry?
Yes, sorry. So capital allocation and operating cash allocation, is risk management conducted on a kind of sliding scale based upon affordability?
I would say no. I'm like the risk and control owner can sometimes games are played between operating expense and capex, depending on the year and the profitability of the company. If it's like it's really a case of how the company is deciding to allocate those resources based on its risk appetite and tolerance. So, I saw the companies that I've worked for, spend hundreds of millions of dollars on risk reduction with no corresponding increase in operations or production. Obviously those kinds of decisions go all the way up to the board to get blessed. But they're based on that very clear and common normalized understanding amongst the senior executive team and the board on what they consider to be the company's risk appetite and tolerance.
Perfect.
And again, some of those things may take years to fund, but they happen.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here. Is it required to audit all processes, say at least annually, and more frequent for level 1?
No. What you need is evidence that those controls are working. Those critical controls are working, and there's lots of ways to do that. That could be through observation programs. It could be through monitoring reports, maintenance inspection programs. There's different key performance indicators. There's a host of ways that people demonstrate conformance, controlled conformance beyond doing audits. Audits are one tool to do that, and certainly you don't have to do it every year. For our hazardous operations, we did. The corporate team did deep dives there every 3 years, but again, it wouldn't be all 18 elements. It wouldn't be all 700 odd process safety requirements. It would be focused dives on critical controls, critical elements where we saw where the organization's own self-assessments, which should happen annually, were indicating weakness, or we wanted to follow up on the effectiveness of mitigating measures that they put in place.
Great, perfect. So I think that was our last question for today. So thank you so much, everyone, for asking these very interesting questions. And of course, thank you, John, for giving us this informative presentation. So if anyone has any last minute points, I would then redirect you to info@nimonik.com and we'll be able to answer any questions. So please note that we will send you a copy of the slides and the recording of this presentation later on today or at the beginning of the day tomorrow. So one last big thank you to everyone. Have a great day, and we'll hopefully hear from you soon.
Thank you, everyone.